Mr. Speaker, when we took the initiative to legalize marijuana here back in 2021, it was my first term. And I distinctly remember that lengthy public hearing. And what I remember most was I was uncharacteristically quiet throughout the entire thing, until a gentleman came before the committee on marijuana, and he was a chief state's attorney or some equivalent in Colorado, however they do it, but it's something equivalent to our chief state's attorney in Colorado when they legalized the marijuana. And he testified before the committee. And I raised my hand, and I remember distinctly the chairman saying, Representative Howard, you've been quiet tonight. You had a question. I said, yes, something piqued my interest. And what piqued my interest was this. When states like Colorado, back in 2012 and 2013, began legalizing marijuana, and states like Connecticut began the path to legalization, beginning with decriminalization, which is what we did back around that same time, 2013. We saw a heroin epidemic in this country like we've never seen before, losing hundreds of thousands of American lives to drug overdoses. Awful time. Been to many, many, many of them myself, right in my own small town. And I said to the state's attorney or equivalent that was testifying back then, I asked him, I said, you know, did you see an increase in heroin and other use and other drugs when you legalized marijuana? He said, yes, we did. In fact, it was very high. And I said, do you think that that might be because of the laws of supply and demand? And he asked the question back. He didn't understand my question. So let me help my colleagues out. The illicit drug business is a business. Illicit as it may be, it is a business. And it works on supply and demand. And I don't want to get into this whole debate in here about the border and things like that, but it is a fact that drugs like fentanyl and heroin come into this country from illegal cartels outside this country that are not under control within their own country. That's undisputed. How we're going to address it is a big argument. That's not for this chamber, but that's undisputed. So when those cartels were making their money by shuttling marijuana into our country, they were happy. But when we started legalizing marijuana in the United States, the demand for marijuana from those cartels went away. So what did they do? They did what any good business owner would do. They switched their product to meet a new demand and started shuttling heroin and fentanyl into this country. And I asked that state's attorney, I said, do you think that's why? And his answer to me, I remember very well, was saying, that is amazing point. Nobody brought that up, and I was shocked. How could nobody have thought about that? It's exactly what happened. It is exactly what happened in this country, and it contributed to hundreds of thousands of deaths of young Americans because of irresponsible work done here. So, as you know, we legalized marijuana nonetheless. So now we're taking that sort of next step, and now we're going to decriminalize small amounts of psilocybin. 10 years from now, somebody else will be here, and they'll be legalizing it, I'm sure. So I bring that up because I think it's an important thing to say that we need to be prepared before we do these things. We can't ignore the fact, Mr. Speaker, that at the same time we legalize this new drug, we saw an increase in fatalities and fatal crashes on our roads. In fact, right in my district, a young man was driving under the influence of marijuana when he hit and killed a nurse on her way home from work, hit her head on. He was subsequently charged, and then the investigation proved that, in fact, he was under the influence of marijuana. One of the big concerns that I have, and there was a discussion earlier about the standardized field sobriety tests. Now, the standardized field sobriety tests are that. They're standard, and they're standardized because they were created and measured to a scientific standard, which is 0.10. So the science behind the 3 standard field sobriety tests is that if you exhibit X number of clues, for in layman's terms, if you, quote, fail the test, we don't use those terms in police work, but then you are scientifically to be above 0.10. And you heard earlier, and it's a fact, that if somebody's under the influence of cocaine or heroin or psilocybin or any other litany of drugs that we put in our bodies, you are likely to fail those standardized field sobriety tests. The problem is that there's no measured scientific standard to them, right? So if you are a police officer and you pull somebody over and you think they're drunk and you run through a standardized field sobriety test and they exhibit all the clues and you have it on camera and you report and you bring them in and they refuse the test, pretty easy case to prosecute, right? Because it's a standardized test. You've been trained to the standard, to administer the test to the standard, and the science behind it says you're over 0.10. 0.08 is our prima facie standard. Pretty simple for our chief state's attorney and his attorneys to prosecute. Gets a little bit more tricky when it's not alcohol. So you bring the person in, they take the test, they blow triple zeros. Okay, so they, quote, failed the test, but it's not alcohol. Well, now we have to kind of figure out what else is going on because, again, there's not the scientific standard. So in the state of Connecticut, we have drug recognition experts, specially trained police officers who run through a new battery of tests in the booking room to include a lot of physiology, well beyond my head, to determine what that body and those signs are telling them as to what drug may be on board if the person does not submit to the test. Because for those who don't know, if you're arrested for a suspicion of operating under the influence in the state of Connecticut, you have a right to refuse a blood test. But if you refuse a urine or a breath test, in this case it would be urine, a urine test, administrative per se sanctions are different per our statutes. So the person refuses the test, it becomes a little bit more difficult to prosecute absent a drug recognition expert's analysis. I hope that made sense, and I hope my colleagues are tracking what I'm saying. The problem is that we only have about 60 drug recognition experts in the state of Connecticut. 60 for 169 municipalities and the 3.5 million people who live here, not counting those who drive through our state on the daily or on the weekly or certainly seasonally. We have 60-something. Mr. Speaker, I submit that's inefficient. It's not going to work. And if we're going to go down the road of decriminalizing yet another drug in the state of Connecticut, and the chairman said we're not legalizing it. He's right. I've read this bill carefully. We're not legalizing it. I think this is a step towards legalization, but that's not what's before us today. What's before us today is decriminalization. But as we heard from proponents, the idea behind decriminalization is to stop the too much prohibition on the use of it. So we end up with more people using it. I think what's important to know is that studies were done. Studies were done by our government. And in those studies, for example, 4,000 individuals, 4,447 to be exact, between 16 and 64 were studied who had reported using hallucinogen, which this is, in the past year. And I'm going to save my colleagues the colloquy about the whole study and whatnot, except to say the conclusion. And the conclusion is that nearly 1 in 10 individuals who report using hallucinogens also report driving under the influence of hallucinogens, which are drugs that affect their perception and their risk-taking with alarming, quote, alarming implications for driving safety. This bill, absent an increase in drug recognition experts in our state, is a major public safety concern. Speaker, this simply adds a section to the bill to appropriate $1 million to DESP for the purposes of training and retention of drug recognition experts. Mr. Speaker, one of the barriers to drug recognition expert training is because there's actually federal money that departments can use to get their officers trained. Problem is, as you know, as my colleagues know, many of our police departments are shorthanded. So if you send an officer away for training for the week or 2 weeks or however long they're gone doing that, somebody's got to backfill that shift. And that's costly because it's overtime. And that's one of the barriers. So this $1 million appropriated to DESP to be used within our 90-some police departments and in the state police for more drug recognition experts would mitigate some of the public safety concerns. Now, we heard the chairwoman of the Appropriations Committee earlier say that the budget's still being worked out. So I know that if this amendment were to be accepted, it's going to have to be transferred to the Appropriations Committee, which is a problem this late in the session. But I also know, because I've been here long enough, that when that budget's done, we're going to have a pretty extensive document that has a lot of things in it. So I think that if this legislature and this chamber today were to accept this amendment and pass this bill with the amendment, I'm sure that our friends in the Appropriation Committee, having heard the majority vote of their colleagues, can find a way in that comprehensive bill associated with the budget to get this in, to address that public safety concern. We're talking about $1 million to save an unknown number of lives. Mr. Speaker, I move adoption. I ask when the vote be taken by roll.
If all the members have voted, the machine will be locked. And the clerk, where are you? We'll take a tally. Will the clerk please announce the tally?
LCO 8733, designated House D. Total number voting 143, necessary for adoption 72. Those voting yea were 47. Those voting nay 96, and absent and not voting 8.
The amendment fails.